Hey, everybody. Welcome back to this month's episode of the Riverside Project podcast. My name is Chandler James, the Director of Church Mobilization here. And on this month's episode, you're going to get the incredible privilege to hear from Amber, who is our founder and executive director. And she's actually going to sit down and get to have a conversation with her husband, Drew Knowles, who is the rector and lead pastor of Oak Forest Anglican Church here in Houston. Drew is a father of four. He's a former foster, now adoptive parent, and he recently co-authored a book called Hospitality, the Convivial Mission of God. I've had the privilege of knowing Drew for the last couple of years, and man, he is just an incredible guy. He is someone who can speak very heavily towards the subject of hospitality, and so this month you're going to get a chance to really just get to dive into that conversation, this idea of hospitality and what that looks in our city, what that looks like in our churches, and what that should look like in our homes as well. And so Drew has a really big vision of hospitality for our city, for our church, for his church. And man, we just get a privilege this month to get a snippet of kind of what that could look like for ourselves. And so I really hope that you enjoy this conversation between Amber and her husband, that it challenges you, that it encourages you along your journey this month. And so with that being said, here's this month's episode.
I don't think that everyone should foster a child, but I do think that foster care is one of the chief demonstrations of what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I can't think of a purer form of not being transactional in the way that you love a person. You have nothing to gain from doing that.
Welcome to the Riverside Project podcast. We are mobilizing Houston to empower families and transform generations. We hope these conversations will give you a greater understanding of the issues facing our community and inspire you to find your place along the river. Drew, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
As we start off all of our podcasts, tell us a little bit about who you are, how you became an Anglican priest, and your journey into this ministry of hospitality.
Yeah. So I am Drew Knowles. I have a wife and 4 young kids. I grew up in Nacogdoches, Texas, moved to Houston in 2010. I was getting out of the Navy, moving into law school. It was during that 1 year of law school that I did before dropping out that I was called to serve the church in a vocational capacity. I spent 10 years as a non-denominational pastor, and then over the past couple years have been, we've made a move into the Anglican Church in North America, and that has been very good. Feels like home.
Yeah. You recently, as we mentioned earlier, released a book alongside Father Mark Bryans called Hospitality, the Convivial Mission of God. Can you share a little bit about just what is that book about? Where did this idea of hospitality come to be?
Yeah, so that book was written first for the church, but really I started thinking about hospitality and the Lord's emphasis on hospitality through the process of fostering children. I see hospitality as essentially opening up, making room, making space for someone else, another, and doing that in a loving and welcoming way. And that is fundamentally what foster care is. It's opening up your home, not just your home, opening up your life to a child who needs your home, needs your life. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first time that I really started thinking about hospitality. But then I began thinking about it in terms of the church and in terms of the church's mission, in terms of the church's worship. And so I gave a talk a few years ago at a small conference that was the genesis of that book project. And Father Mark Bryans is a good friend of mine. He's also an Anglican priest in Honolulu and just brilliant. And so it was a lot of fun putting that together for him.
Can you go back a little bit and talk about what does the Bible say about hospitality? It's not necessarily a word that we would think is actually in the Bible. I don't know if there is a word that we would translate as hospitality. I know we hear things like mission and justice and mercy and benevolence, but how did you come to stick with this word in particular? Is it the same as mission? Is it different from mission? What does the Bible say about it?
Our claim in the book is that God is actually hospitable in his very essence. That as Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they are eternally making room for the other. And so hospitality is actually baked in to the Godhead. And so it should be no surprise that we see that value of hospitality working itself out throughout human history as recorded in Scripture. And so I think you can trace the theme of hospitality from Genesis to Revelation. I think you can trace it through every book of the Bible. I think you see God interacting with the world in a hospitable way. And so, yeah, I think you can say, in fact, I do say, I am comfortable saying the word hospitality in place of the word mission in almost every instance. Because the mission of God is fundamentally his hospitality towards us, him opening himself up so that we can come in.
Yeah. I think we've had some conversations too around the idea of mission, right? Early on in our 20s, we're doing ministry in the church and we're talking about being on mission, but that is kind of a theoretical, it's hard to understand what does that actually mean for people. Is it going to a pub? Is it going to, evangelize? What does that actually mean? But I think, as I think you talk a little bit about in the book, hospitality gives handles for what does it mean to be on mission? It's being hospitable. Because maybe it's just a word that is a little bit more practical for people. It gives a little bit more handles to it.
Mission is an abstract concept. Most people don't know, when a pastor says be missional or be on mission, most people don't know what he's talking about. But everyone has an idea of what being hospitable might look like. And so it gives handles. It's more tangible.
How is that meant to change us as the church? Like, what is your vision for how the idea of hospitality actually becomes worked out within a church, within our church?
Right. So this is also in the book, but the idea is that traditionally Christian worship, the liturgy and the structure and the flow of what we do when we gather together on Sundays is meant to demonstrate for us, emphasize to us that God is welcoming us into his house. He's forgiving us. He's cleaning us up. He's instructing us. But the pinnacle of that entire thing is him welcoming us to his table to share a meal with him. Christian worship is hospitality in action. It is divine hospitality toward us. And the basic idea is that having come into the Lord's house and received that hospitality, it's not supposed to terminate there. It's supposed to bleed out into the neighborhood. We have now learned from God himself how we're supposed to use our homes, how we're supposed to use our dinner tables by opening our home and welcoming in the other.
How do you see a vision for the church taking the hospitality that we see within the Godhead? I
mean, for a lot of people, it's walking across the street and saying to that neighbor that you've lived next to for 4 years but have never really talked to, hey, I'd like to have you over for dinner. If you have to have an occasion for that, great. And sometimes you do, but everyone enjoys that. Everyone enjoys to be welcomed. But I really do think that is, if we think about the mission of God in those terms, it's going to happen. So it could be sharing a meal with a neighbor, and it could be welcoming a child into your home out of the foster care system, or welcoming refugees, or it could be low-hanging fruit, it could be highly difficult and long-term, but there are just the number of ways you could practice that are endless, truly.
What do you think keeps us from that, whether individually or corporately as the church? What are the kind of barriers to why we don't practice that type of hospitality?
In our culture, busyness is a huge one. We also kind of we tend to conceive of hospitality more as entertaining. It's not something we do for the other person as much as we do it for ourselves. Sometimes we want to be able to Instagram what we make for the other person, rather than just wanting to open our home and be a blessing to this other person. Yeah.
We touched on this a little bit earlier. There's an idea within your book that explains this concept of the table. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what that means?
Yeah. So the first table is the Lord's table. It's Holy Communion. It is the Eucharist. God welcomes us to his table. He practices loving welcome and hospitality toward us at that table, and then he sends us out. He teaches us there what we're supposed to do at our own tables. So from the Lord's table, he sends us in mission, and through our tables, our neighbors draw near to God.
Both sides are actively working in hospitality. Yeah. How does this idea of the table help us to really understand our role as the church? Are there any implications to that outside of what we've already kind of discussed? What happens when that's working the way it should?
I think it's messy, but I think it's also a lot of fun. I think people who step into this sort of way of living start having some really cool stories they get to tell to other people. You start having people show up at church that don't know anything. And you've got to figure out how to not only speak to those who have been Christians for 40 years, but speak to a brand new newcomer.
That's something that we've kind of been talking as a team. Of course, as we engage with churches, as we mobilize them to serve their vulnerable neighbors and those who are vulnerable within their own congregations. We also had this conversation recently. I think it's easy for us, even when we give opportunities for churches to engage their community, a lot of it instinctually becomes transactional. I will give this thing. They may accept it. They may ask for more. I hope they don't ask for more. I hope that by me giving this one thing that they're no longer needy anymore. There's this kind of a tendency to have a transactional relationship. And I think this idea of hospitality presses us to go beyond this transactional relationship into actually stepping into the life, or as we would say, stepping into the river with somebody. It's not easy. As you said, it's messy, but it's worth it if we're actually going to see change in our city, right?
Absolutely. And I really do think that, I don't think that everyone should foster a child, but I do think that foster care is one of the chief demonstrations of what I'm talking about. I can't think of a purer form of not being transactional in the way that you love a person. You have nothing to gain from doing that. So
obviously, you're a foster parent. We have fostered and then adopted 2 of our 4 kids. How have you seen this idea of hospitality? Obviously, this book is more recent. We started the foster care process back in 2014. How has maybe that experience shaped this? And how has parenting our children, has it had any impact on this idea of hospitality?
When we first began the foster care process, I didn't know what we were getting into. I don't think it's really possible to know fully what you're getting into. But I have learned a lot from our children when it comes to the practice of hospitality. I mentioned hospitality versus entertaining. Our children are well entertained, but you don't bring a child into your home as a form of entertainment for them. It's an act of hospitality, and it's not pretty all the time. It's not always Instagrammable. They see your house when it's at its messiest. They see your parenting when it's at its worst. But there's something about hospitality in that too. We are not perfect people. And the world needs to know that we're not perfect people in the way that we practice hospitality, but to know that we are redeemed and forgiven and gracious and welcoming the way our God is welcoming, even in the midst of imperfections. I hope our children grow up having at least learned that lesson from us.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what Jason Johnson always talks about, where a lot of people start off fostering, and I think that there were, as much as I don't want to believe that it was there was some piece of, wanting to gain a child for our family. We always said we were open-handed to whether they would stay or whether they would need to go back to family or wherever. But there is this idea of I'm doing this for another person, rather than the idea of, we are giving our family to a child or to children. That's a very different concept. One is kind of a savioristic mentality, and one is true hospitality. And I think it's kind of the same with what we see in all other forms of hospitality. Like you said, sometimes it's self-serving really at its root. But hopefully, as you step into those spaces, you start to realize, oh, this has actually a lot less to do with me if I'm truly doing it and after caring for somebody through the difficult moments.
I think you even see that in the way Father, Son, and Spirit relate to one another. You not only see making room, making space, and welcoming, but you also see an active giving. Mm-hmm. So there's this dance of welcome and giving that I do think sits at the heart of hospitality, to your point.
Yeah. As you envision this idea of hospitality moving out into past the church, into the city, what do you dream about in terms of like this no longer being like a theological concept, but actually working itself out? What is your dream in that regard?
I pastor a church in a single neighborhood called Oak Forest. So I don't have a grand vision for Houston necessarily. I do have a vision for our neighborhood, and I would hope that vision takes place in all neighborhoods. But I truly believe that even a small church within a neighborhood who really commits itself to practicing hospitality biblically, like God practices it for us, mm-hmm. Even a small church in a neighborhood like that, years down the road, people say, man, that is a good neighborhood to live in. And I still think they're weird, and I don't know that I believe it, but I'm glad those Christians are here, because it's just a better neighborhood to live in.
Well, the last 5, we take the last couple of minutes to do last 5 questions, a little bit more rapid fire, just things about you. So let's get started. Are you ready?
No.
I know you're thrilled about these. Mm-hmm. Number 1, what is your hidden talent that most people might be surprised to know about you?
Mario Kart. That's it. That is my only hidden talent.
Our kids could attest to that.
Well, I was going to say our 9-year-old beat me for the first time last week, so...
How did that make you feel, though?
Proud.
Okay, number 2. If we could get into your closet, how many pairs of shoes would you have? This is for all the listeners. I obviously know.
How many pairs?
How many pairs of shoes would we see in your closet? Unless somebody took some of them
10,
recently.
Probably.
10 shoes?
Yes, we were recently robbed, so I can't give you an exact number.
We were recently robbed. Moving on to number 3. When you're in the car by yourself, what are you listening to?
Podcasts. But if there are other people in the car, it's music.
What item or technology do you hope will be invented in the next 20 years?
Someone needs to invent some way to get all the power lines underground.
And number 5, do you have any examples in your life where you were treated with the kind of hospitality that you are speaking of in your book?
This is a cop-out answer, but every Sunday.
How?
Every Sunday, the Lord treats me the way I'm talking about. He welcomes me into his house. When I was undeserving of it, he lays out a meal for me. He welcomes me to his table. He speaks words of blessing over me. He forgives me. He sends me out refreshed.
Thank you for all that you do within our church. I know that there are a lot of people in our church who are cared for well by you and by really our whole team of volunteers and people. So we're grateful for that. I am grateful to be your wife. We're grateful that you were on the podcast today.
Thank you.
To to those listening, we hope these conversations have inspired you to find your place along the river. And we welcome you to join us in bringing hope and renewal to the city of Houston. If you'd like more information on how to get involved, please visit riversideproject.org and submit a contact form. We'll see you next time.